And so when you start working the brain waves, you're dealing with the mind and the soul. Like you're dealing with not taking it down into the form. You're kind of allowing like soul energy to come in and be the thing that displaces the thoughts or the energy, whatever you want to call it, in the mind. And when I did it, it was just one of those things where like I was doing it and I was like, God, I just like I'm tired of like this is why I stopped doing corporate work. Like it started to be so much cleanup from I was brought in situations where I would end up being the target like very quickly, because I was the guy that was going to help bring change or was trying to find the person stealing or, it was always something like that. And so I just like, God, let's just try something different. And I did that. And then I had to step back and reflect, like, why did that work? And if you think of like the difference between the mind body connection versus the mind soul connection is the energy coming in as consciousness, where when you're doing the mind and the body, it's energy, but it's not energy with consciousness. It's life force, it's all these things, but it helps processes go in the body, and all that's very, very necessary. But when you start playing with the brain waves, you're bringing in different kinds of energy with consciousness. And so, we're unwinding this thing where we've done like, oh, we're done with colors and then we're doing with chakras, and there's this kind of like theme or this thing where you're going really deep at pulling down the layers of the onion, you could say. And so if you look at the idea of the brain waves having an effect on us and then having energy with consciousness that then affects other people, in a way, it produced a healing for the other person. And so, like when that happened, I started playing with like, well, if you look at the oils from the foundation of mystical healing from the beginning of the year, there is violet, there's green, there's blue, there's orange. Then we got to gold. Gold is physicalized spiritual energy. So it's helping the body produce a physicalized spiritual energy. And then you get into sacred blue. Sacred blue is bringing in a kind of energy that has consciousness. So my thought was, why not take the sacred blue and mix it with the brainwaves? And so then you have electric or consciousness and consciousness, and it just like it kind of was building on each other. And I'd already been playing with the idea of the brain waves with working with angels, when we were going through and really delving deep into the angels, which we are going to come back around to. But we were unwinding things so that when we started doing brainwave work, it would go deeper faster, like, and it would have less like potential like issues, because not everybody's in the same place with the conditioning. So we're just trying to establish like a foundation of things people could do if they needed it, things to do to prepare for it. And, sometimes the preparation starts to produce the result, like, for example, with Stara, I'm teaching these like modules, and we're teaching them here in the US, but we're also teaching them independently in India. And, they want the clairvoyance class. Like, and I'm like, it's a whole series. It's a series of these little modules that are these little awakenings. And they kind of argued with me every step of the way. And each series is there's a series of 3, and each one has 7 little modules in it. And we went back and forth, and I'd give them the module and they'd want to tweak it. And they'd want to change, like instead of working with white light, they were wanted to change it to colors. And I was like, just follow the instructions, just keep following the instructions. And a little bit of time went by, and they kind of settled down and just followed the instructions. And they're going, okay, I think we're teaching to like 250 people, but I'm doing it through video, so I don't really see them. But they're already saying a significant amount of the group is already starting to become clairvoyant. And we haven't even gotten to the official clairvoyant class yet. We're just doing all the preparatory work. And that's the issue with even teaching clairvoyance is you try to stimulate something, but if there's all this conditioning, like it's not unwound enough. And so the thing that is good with the brain waves is it's energy with consciousness. So it impacts people's needs, even though they're in different places. And that person that I was having a contact with, I actually didn't even know who the person was. I mean, they told me who it was on paper, but like, I don't know them. Like, never interacted with them, nothing. They started receiving like a healing because I was inhaling it and just thinking of them. And it wasn't just like, oh, it's soothing. It's like, no, they're shifting. Their behavior is shifting. So my behavior shifted, their behavior shifted. And it's a little bit of a game changer. Like, it's really like, ugh. So even the approach of psychological healing, we think of it as like, oh, I'd like to get rid of stress, or I'd like to get rid of this. And we all think that way. But what if you could tweak it to where you don't have to get rid of stress, you stop stressing out and you just stay, like when you're exercising and your mind just doesn't go blank, it just goes kind of quiet, right? What if you could be able to do that in action where it's not having to be physical activity, but it's mental and spiritual and then outward? That makes you way more dynamic, and it's very developing for perception and clairvoyance, but two, it's very developing to the will. It's super developing to the will. It's developing to the love. It's developing to an intelligence aspect. But the hardest thing to develop in a person is the will aspect. Love, we all kind of innately have it. Like you can kind of cultivate that through experiences and situations. Harnessing cycles and light, with divine intelligence, you could put people in a schedule and eventually kind of produce a result. Will is hard, will is very hard. And it's not taught very often or very openly in spiritual circles, because it's also a really slippery slope. Like if the wrong kind of will gets activated, it could turn somebody from being in their higher nature into their lower nature really super quick. And so it's hard to have a safety valve in there. But when you start working the brainwaves are like a safety valve. Like you're not having to like force something. You're doing the mystical vibration or mystical component of it, like, which is like kind of doing it from the inside out rather than trying to stimulate it and make the outside go in. You almost are like evolving it outwardly so that it's just you coming to it organically. And in the situation that you think of, like in conflicts and in the corporate setting, the reason why it's so difficult is it's very will oriented. All the different aspects. People have goals, people have deadlines, people have somebody to answer to, people need to get a job done, people need to get reviewed, like, all these things. You go home and you're loving, but usually at work you're being a little bit more like willful. And willful doesn't necessarily mean aggressive. I actually mean like either like focused and being able to produce a result and do the right thing, and eventually it becomes of the crown, which is um, um, uh, you're kind of serving, like you're serving something outside of yourself. Like even in the workplace of like shifting and changing, you're producing a result and you're drawing something from within that's like bigger than yourself. It's not like I want this. It's like, okay, I'm hired to do this. I have to do this, right? In spiritual circles, a lot of times it's doing service oriented acts, doing healing, feeding, serving people who are in need. Eventually what that is turning into is the will becomes aligned with the soul, and the will and the brain begin serving the soul rather than the emotions or the mind or the logic or the body or whatever it is. And again, it's an energy that goes back and forth, but there's also like little behavioral things that go back and forth between people that will start to like tweak, and it will start to shift the behavior of not just an individual. You could actually shift it into bigger groups. It's part of this like kind of theorem where if you have qualitative action, even though the quantitative aspect is much bigger than you, if you stick to something that is like genuine and qualitative in nature, which means setting an example and inviting reciprocation, you can affect change much greater than the size. You can affect much greater change within the quantitative aspect.